Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily update for January 28th, 2021. Well, I have an interesting report for you today from what's going on around the world, including the online conference being put on by the Davos global banker elite. There's a stream of propaganda coming out from both the supporters of Davos as well as its opponents, pronouncing essentially that it's a done deal, that it's futile to resist the global order that's being introduced for banking, for Green New Deal, and so on. That this is especially true since the coup was successful in putting Joe Biden into the White House. You might say that the slogan for this comes from Thomas Friedman, a well-paid hack for the New York Times, the leader of the fake news companies, when he said there is no alternative. So it's a done deal. Well, the fact is it's not a done deal. As you will see from the report I'm about to present to you, there's widespread resistance, including from a number of nations, including from some that are speaking at Davos. For example, the keynote delivered by China's Xi Jinping. He issued a call for multilateralism, not unilateralism, not the imposition by Wall Street banks and London banks of their desire to have a global banker's dictatorship. Instead, he said there must be agreement among nations for economic development based on scientific and technological advance, not a return to feudal sustainable systems, which is the goal of the Davos elite, such as windmills, solar power, and so on. No, the Chinese are developing clean coal. They have plans to have advances in nuclear energy, including fusion. These are not the ideal energy sources of Davos, which is trying to lower the energy flux density of the planet as part of a global depopulation scheme. In fact, what Xi discussed in his speech is the importance of the development of poor nations. Now remember, it was Barack Obama who lectured African students who said, you can never have an American-style standard of living without the planet boiling over. Well, the Chinese are in Africa, they're in Asia, investing in projects of rail, of dams, of power plants that will raise the standard of living in those countries. This goes against the global agenda 2030 and so on. So we're seeing a significant resistance coming from China, which will not allow the Western bankers to come in and establish a speculative system to loot China, as we in the United States have allowed them to do. Now, then there was Putin's speech. And besides his support for Xi, he warned that there will be war if there's no development. Here's his exact quote. He said, "There's a chance that we will face a formidable breakdown in global development, which will be fraught with a war of all against all, and attempts to deal with contradictions through the appointment of internal and external enemies and the destruction of not only traditional values, but fundamental freedoms. We have a shared responsibility to prevent this scenario." Now, it's not a coincidence that in presenting this, Putin launched a strong attack on big tech and censorship. And he raised an interesting point. Why is it that the big tech companies, the social media companies, have full support for the regime change operation in Russia being run by the so-called opposition leader Navalny? And they're promoting the growth of a democracy movement to bring down Putin's government. Why is that allowed by big tech? But big tech is suppressing free speech and free press in the United States. Interesting point made by Putin. Then he denounced the great transfer of wealth that's occurring to 1% of the population, which is the Davos program. If it's implemented, it's going to drive down the living standards of 99% of the world, destroy what's left of the middle class in the United States, while providing huge volumes of money as a plaything for the speculators in the transatlantic region. And he finally made the point that this is all a debt bubble of financial assets, which will come tumbling down, and that's where the danger of war comes in. Now keep in mind the push at Davos is not for sovereign national governments to carry out these policies, but private companies, private corporations to make the rules of international trade and finance. This is the corporate cartels that drafted the free trade agreements that shut down industry in the United States and Western Europe. It's the private finance through central banks, which was described by one BlackRock executive as a $50 trillion opportunity. For whom? For the speculators, the hedge funds, the shadow banking system. All you have to look at is who's making the rules there. BlackRock, Bank of America, Standard & Chartered, Citibank. You can have a list of them. 130 banks, according to former Bank of England Chairman Mark Carney, have already signed a charter to restrict lending to productive enterprises and instead only allow loans for so-called sustainable energy production. And squatting obscenely over the whole Davos policy is Prince Charles of England, of Great Britain. Prince Charles, who's a known figure committed to population reduction, as is his father, who I presume is still alive, Prince Philip. So what stands in the way of this great reset or this great transformation? Well, number one, sovereign nations, in particular led by Russia and China. This had been the policy of Donald Trump as well. Sovereign nations, not nations that are subordinated to multinational corporate cartels and courts that overrule the policies of the sovereign nations. Well, Donald Trump was knocked out in a regime change operation. The same people who went after Trump are trying to bring down Putin and Xi Jinping. Now, there's a shift going on in Germany. It's subtle still, and we'll see what comes from it. But German industry, German productive sectors, engineering and so on, do not accept the idea of the Green New Deal. They're still fighting. And the fact that there's an attempt that started under Pompeo's direction and is continuing with Biden to shut down the Nord Stream pipeline, which brings oil and gas from Russia into Germany and 11 other countries in Europe. The attempt to shut that down is forcing the Germans to respond in a somewhat nationalistic way, which is good. It's a very good development. And it also looks as though what Merkel said is that she's with Xi as opposed to with Biden when it comes to this idea of a conference of democratic nations that Biden has called for, which is a thinly disguised plan to target Russia and China. So you have sovereign nations standing against this and the American people. With proper leadership, the American people will resist this. That's why Donald Trump was elected. That's why 75 million people voted for Trump. That's why, to suppress this, the people in the United States tied to the Davos elite, which includes Silicon Valley, which include Wall Street, which include corporate cartels, are committed to a policy of censorship. They're committed to accelerated surveillance state through a new Patriot Act, which is being pushed in the Congress. We saw an introduction to a bill from a Florida congresswoman, which would outlaw security clearance for anyone who promotes conspiracy theories. Well, let me ask you this. Would that mean that John Brennan and Clapper and all of their allies would be removed from security clearance since they promoted the biggest conspiracy theory ever, so-called Russiagate, which has been proven definitively to have been a lie and a fabrication? So if that's the case, well, so be it. But the fact is that this is being applied against those people who oppose this Davos establishment. So the issue here is, can we get the American people to move with courage and with conviction against this deep state, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, City of London attempt for a global banker's dictatorship? Well, we'll give you the details on who's pushing it, what they're pushing, and how to defeat it. And the starting point is to have the United States join with Russia and China and India, and hopefully several other sovereign nation states, against this atrocity of a global corporate cartel, pushing what used to be called fascism. Corporatism is fascism. That's what it was with Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, where the corporations and banks rose up over and above the states to impose their economic policies, which were looting for the speculators and austerity and killing for the population. We can't let that happen. There's a reason people said never again. And it's time that the American people grasp the true nature of the enemy, the British Empire and its policies, and join us at the LaRouche organization, at the Schiller Institute, to make sure that we have a four-power agreement to defeat this attempt to establish a global dictatorship. Thanks for joining me. Tomorrow's Friday. I'll take your questions. Please send me your questions at harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to take them then.